Hello and good evening and welcome to another program on Law and Order. Now, you have all heard this concept or this word called public-private partnership. Now, is this a legal position or is this just an arrangement? You've also seen the massive amount of development that is going on in Sri Lanka, and this concept of public-private partnership has come to light and highlighted in the recent past. So we thought on today's program on Law and Order, we will get an expert on this area of law and we will try to educate you on what this area of law. My expert guest today is no stranger to Rupawani. He was here with us once before, Dr. Asanga Gunawansa. Dr. Asanga Gunawansa holds a PhD in law from the National University of Singapore and an LLM in International Economics Law from University of Warwick. Dr. Gunawansa, thank you very much for coming back to Law and Order. And straight away, I will go into the question, what is PPP in only short or public-private partnership?
Thank you for inviting me again. Well, PPP stands for public-private partnerships. Yeah. So if you are looking for a definition, there is no single standard definition that can be used to identify what a PPP is. Even if you look at the multilateral banks such as the ADB and the World Bank, and so on, will be using slightly different versions of their own interpretations or definitions, for PPP. But generally speaking, a PPP is a contractual relationship between a public sector entity and a private party, a private investor, for a long-term public utility or infrastructure development project in which the private investor will be funding the development costs and taking a lot of risks associated with the operational aspects as well as construction aspects of this project, and where the revenue is linked to the payments that the developer will eventually receive.
Now, can you give me an example?
Yeah, a good example would be, let's assume that a developing country wants to develop a new port or a seaport or an airport or a public infrastructure facility such as a highway. Now, if this developing country doesn't have sufficient funds to allocate from its own budget for these development projects, they will have to look around, and either obtain a foreign grant or a foreign loan and then get the project done by appointing a contractor, in which event the obligation to pay the loan is with the state entity. But if they don't want to take that risk, and if they want to pass that risk to a private investor, they can invite private investors to come and develop the project, run it for a certain period of time to recover their costs as well as expected profits, and then hand the profit back to the government.
Right. Now, so this is different to the other types of contracts we heard about BOT, build, operate and transfer, BOOT and BOO. Are these different?
No, they are all. So if you look at the concept of public-private partnerships in a very wide sense,
right,
what it means is a long-term relationship has come into existence between a public entity and a private entity.
Right.
So how do you establish this relationship? That can be in the form of a joint venture.
Right.
It can be in the form of a BOO, build, own, operate contract, or it can be in the form of a build, operate, transfer contract.
Yes.
You can come up with various acronyms, to identify the contractual relationship depending on what has been negotiated between the parties.
Right. Now, governments and multilateral banks, which generally comes into funding this kind of projects like you mentioned, more and more are wanting to have PPP projects.
Correct.
They are saying it's the way forward. Why is this?
Several reasons. If you look at the UN system now, we have approximately 200 countries. And out of these 200 countries, about 150 countries fall into the category of developing or least developed. Right? And an institution like the World Bank, for example, where do they get money? These are not profit-making entities, right? Yeah. World Bank is like a club, made out of members.
Right.
So they collect money from the members.
Right.
So if you have a lot of poor members, then obviously the money coming in from these poor members will be less. So few countries have to fund the development initiatives of approximately 200 countries. So institutions, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank no longer has sufficient funds to grant developing countries to develop or to address all their development needs. So therefore they have come up with this solution of passing that investment risk to private sector entities who have money And in addition to money, they also have the technical capacity, and also they have administration and managerial expertise to run these projects efficiently. So that is the reason why the multilateral banks such as the World Bank and ADB promote public-private partnerships as the way forward for development.
So actually they are not giving, they are expecting people to come with money and expertise and do a project for a government of a developing country.
They continue to play a role. Now say for example in the 1960s or early 1970s, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank and other development banks, they provided direct loans or grants to developing countries to do the development projects.
Right.
And sometimes after a period of time, because the loans are paid, you have to write off, and you will not be able to recover the loans. So what they do now is they encourage private sector participation, where a private investor would perhaps, bring up to about 70 to 80% of the development cost in the form of equity and debt, loans that they themselves raise from other development banks, even private sector commercial banks. Then World Bank and ADB might chip in as a lender. So they might provide 10 to 15% of the project development cost as a loan, not to the country concerned, but to the private sector investor who will run the project as a profit-oriented project. So recovery process would be much easier.
Right. If we take an example further to clarify to our viewers, a road where a company comes in, pumps in about 70% of the cash and builds it. Their ROI or the return on investment could be the toll charge they take, or is
it could be the toll charge. It could be the toll charge. But sometimes take for example a least developed country in Africa. You can build a highway, and highway may connect city A and city B, and as a result of that, a lot of other things will be facilitated. But when it comes to recovery of money, the end users might not want to either use this road and use the traditional roads because they can't afford the cost, or the amount of money that can be charged from them from the government will be not very high. So in that situation, the government might have to subsidize. And so what will happen is that the developer will have a projected usage per month and per year in order to recover their cost of construction and the expected profits. So in the event the toll charges they collect don't meet that target, the shortfall will have to be met by the government. So it all depends on how you negotiate and structure your contract.
Okay. So what will be the typical matrix of a PPP contract, and who are the key players or parties?
Yeah. So depending on the type of project, whether it's a build own operate or build operate trans or joint venture, the number of parties involved may be different, but generally there's a multitude of parties involved in these projects, and the project can only start, since it's a public-private partnership, there has to be a public sector and a private sector.
Right.
So the public sector will have to come forward and give permission and promise various concessions to the investor in order to forge that partnership. So that's the public sector entity. It could be a government department, a secretary to a ministry who is entering into a contract on behalf of a department or on behalf of a ministry, or a statutory entity. Like in Sri Lanka, it could be the Road Development Authority or the Sri Lanka Ports Authority. So that's the public sector entity. So they will then enter into agreement with the private sector entity who will undertake the development and who will undertake to bring the investment. In addition to these two key players, as I said, most of the development projects involve a large sums of money. And this money will not always come in the form of equity. For example, if you have to put $500 billion to develop a project in a developing country, chances of a single investor coming and putting that in the form of equity is very, very rare.
Right.
So what would happen is that they will raise the equity, in the form of a, syndicated group, and there will be 5 or 6 different investors coming in and establishing a special purpose vehicle for the purpose of the development, and each one of them will make a contribution towards equity. And that would probably, come up, they will probably come up with about 20 to 30% of the development cost. Then they have to borrow the rest. So they will go to international lending institutions and borrow the balance, by using project financing techniques to develop the project. So then the lenders come in. So these lenders, depending on the country risk, might not want to engage into a commercial agreement with the developer and give money. They might want a back-to-back guarantee from the government itself to say that the project is secure and changing governments will not adversely impact the project. So they will enter into a direct loan agreement or direct lender agreement with the government concerned. So once you take care of the financial aspects of it, then you need a construction company to do the actual development. Then because these projects are run for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes, you need a operation contract with a expert operator to operate the project for a long period of time. Then there is insurance and underwriting agreement that will have to be entered into in order to cover your risks. And eventually there are contracts that you enter into with the end users, right, to deliver whatever product that you have developed and recover your cost.
Right. You mentioned about guaranteeing the PPP, the fund obviously expects a guarantee. And we are talking about developing countries. And we are talking in situations where governments don't have money, and that's why the PPP kicks in. Who generally comes in as a guarantor in these kind of things?
So usually the lenders would want a direct guarantee from the government itself, in which event the treasury will have to provide that guarantee.
Sovereign guarantee,
like a sovereign guarantee. Now, government of Sri Lanka for a period of time, has not been providing sovereign guarantees except in, very exceptional cases. But in those situations, there have been other institutions that can provide guarantee. For example, MIGA, which operates under the World Bank, used to provide such guarantees on behalf of developing countries to the lenders, to ensure that the risk associated with the loans not being paid would be adequately addressed.
Yeah, so still, although like you said that there is less money in ADB and World Banks and all that, they do kick in instances as guarantors, do they?
Correct.
Now, this PPP concept or the model, is it recommended in your opinion to all forms of projects, development projects in a country like Sri Lanka? As you know, we have lots to do in the areas of construction, roads, bridges, railroads and all that kind of thing. Is it recommended?
The simple answer is no. Because, no. Because in my view, any developing country should do their own homework and identify what are the type of projects, right, which could be developed following the PPP procurement method. Now, say for example, because PPP is eventually a profit-oriented project. No private investor is going to put large sums of money to a project unless they can recover it. So in Sri Lanka, if you look at areas such as public health, education, right, are either given free of charge or at heavily subsidized rates to the general public. And our people have gotten used to it. So if you try to bring a private investor and do it in the form of a PPP, and if they suddenly start charging money from public universities for developing public universities and offering education, and from public hospitals, there might be, it might lead to even a political crisis. So the government should therefore either educate the people and get them prepared, to walk towards, that end, or they will have to think of suitable projects that could be developed as commercial ventures with the participation of the private sector entities. So toll roads in Sri Lanka, power projects in Sri Lanka, telecommunication projects, airport upgrades, seaport upgrades, container terminals have worked very well as public-private partnerships, but not other areas. Now, having said that, in certain other countries, even areas where even academics, at the beginning thought might not be able to develop as public-private partnerships, have had success. One example I can give you is water. Now, in Philippines, there are very successful PPPs for water. So the basic argument there was that, average citizen would be happy to pay, for example, a cigarette or a beer or alcohol, but they wouldn't want to pay for water, right? Saying that, we have a right to water. Yes, you may have a right to water, but the government should incur a cost. If the government should incur a cost to develop that facility, and if the money is not coming in the form of taxation or whatever other government revenue is not sufficient to develop this project, then you have to, look at various other models of providing those services to the people. So they went down the track of developing PPPs even for public water, and that has been one of the success stories in the Philippines.
Right. Now, this will it be recommended model for a country like Sri Lanka in things like multimode transport and road building?
Yes, because transport is a big issue in Sri Lanka, and anyway, even at subsidized rate for transport, people pay, right? Because if you don't get to work, you don't get paid simply.
Yes.
So as a result of that, transport sector is something that we can certainly look into. And one of the reasons as to why in the transport sector, for example, developing underground, system, public-private partnerships have not worked so far in Sri Lanka is due to planning-related issues, I think.
Right.
Because the Colombo is not a planned city, so
Right.
it will be difficult to suddenly introduce an underground system in a place like Colombo, and unless you do a proper study and find the routes where you can come up with a development development like that. So that is why perhaps I think the Megapolis Ministry is currently looking at light railways and tramways and so on as an alternative model.
Right. Now, what is the extent of partnership expected by the key stakeholders in a typical PPP arrangement, or if I may say TPP country?
Yeah. It has to be an effective, efficient, true partnership. Now, in some countries, you can see effective, efficient, true partnerships, and in some countries, you don't.
Okay.
Now, even in places like Sri Lanka, sometimes what happens is when we talk about public-private partnerships, the government entities may think that when they give a concession and put pen to paper and sign the public-private partnership,
Yeah.
the partnership ends there, and thereafter they have to put the cap of a regulator and regulate the project. But you have to separate these two roles.
Right.
Yes, you have to regulate, you have a regulator's role to play. But in a partnership, especially when the partnership is for 30 years, you have contractual duties and obligations, running throughout the project's life cycle. So therefore, as a true partner, you have to effectively participate in that project, which means, say, for example, regulatory changes or, changes in law or changes in policy is going to have adverse impact on a public-private partnership. Perhaps the policymakers and the lawmakers may want to even consult the private sector entity with whom they have formed a partnership to find ways as to how this change of law, change of policy might not have adverse impact on the project in which they are a true partner.
Right.
So you can't enter into an agreement today and promise, say 10 things to the investor, and then a year later say that, oh, the law has changed and therefore we can't, fulfill those promises.
Right. Given what you said, is Sri Lanka ready for PPP?
I think yes. I think yes, because the development desire of the politicians as well as the people, is very high. And as we know, we are coming out of a civil war that lasted almost 25 years. So we don't have sufficient public funds to develop public infrastructure and meet the aspirations of the people. So you have to look to the private sector. And some of the PPP projects that have been introduced in Sri Lanka from the mid-1980s, the Colombo Port Terminal being, one of the success stories, have been so far very, very successful. And even a project like the Colombo Port City, I think is going to be very successful going forward. So therefore, yes, we are ready, but we have to, like I said earlier, do our homework and identify key sectors and key areas where PPPs could work, and it could be acceptable socially, culturally, and politically to the people as well.
Yeah. And you were telling about the extent of partnership.
Yes.
And you were telling about countries that were successful in that. If I may take you backtrack a little bit and ask for example.
Yeah, so Singapore.
Singapore.
Now in Singapore there is public-private partnerships, and the strange thing about Singapore is that it is openly admitted even by private sector investors that the more effective partner in their marriage is the public sector entity and not the private sector entity.
Right.
So true leadership is provided to the project. They have a vision, they do their homework, they identify an area, and they take the lead in forging a partnership with the private sector and making sure that the project is successful. So they don't simply put pen to paper and then backtrack and wear the cap of a regulator and try to pick holes in the project development process. So even in countries like Philippines and Vietnam, it has worked. And if you look at the West, in countries like the US, UK, France, there are a lot of successful PPP projects. One of the earliest PPP projects was the Channel Tunnel project, where two governments were involved, Britain and France. And these are successful projects where the
So
state
PPPs
entities
can happen
have.
between governments to government
It can.
as well.
It can.
Right. Now, what are the legal risks a PPP contractor will have, and what are the participants should be aware of?
Yes.
And what are the precautions they can take to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, so a PPP being a contractual relationship, all the typical risks associated with the contract are there, but then there are certain unique risks that you can, you can find which can be associated with public-private partnerships given the long-term relationship that is created. So if you take a 20 or 30-year period, in a good democracy, you will see like 5 or 6 different governments, ruling the country during this period. So as a result of that, there will be change of laws and change of policy. So one of your main risks is to make sure that there is political stability, and change in law would not, adversely impact the project. Then also external political stability is very important, like civil wars, civil strifes, then, disturbance between two different countries and so on could have adverse impact. And if you are looking at 20 to 30 years to recover your cost and profit, stability of the currency that you have invested and stability of the currency, from which you will collect your revenue is very important, right? So how do you address these? Like I, said earlier, risk identification, risk allocation between the two parties to the contract is very important here. So the trick is to identify the party who is most capable and most suitable to deal with a particular risk, and then you park that risk with that particular party. And thereafter, you can look at the underwriters, to provide adequate insurance to make sure that those risks are covered. So even a risk such as act of God could be covered by way of insurance now, of course, at a cost.
Right. We are really running out of time, but if in 1 minute, if you could sum up, could you tell me, Colombo Port City, is it a sustainable development project as far as PPP is concerned?
This is the personal opinion, and I think yes, for the reason that, as I mentioned earlier, Colombo is an unplanned city. And if you are looking at, developing the capital of Sri Lanka or the commercial capital of Sri Lanka to be on par with other more developed cities in Asia like, KL, Singapore and so on, we will have to, look at reclamation of land and developing a modern city. So this project is expected to create over approximately 80 to 90,000 jobs, and there will be secondary foreign direct investment coming into the country to develop, real estate and so on in the reclaimed land. And on top of that, the current government appears to be committed to establish an international financial center following the Dubai or the Qatar model in Sri Lanka, which means, there will be a lot of jobs created, a lot of other opportunities created for Sri Lanka. So looking at it from that perspective, I think, yes, it could be one of the success stories in Sri Lanka going forward.
Dr. Asanga Gunawansa, thank you very much for joining Law and Order today, and thank you for those valuable thoughts on a very rare topic, rare expertise we find in this topic. We'll hope to meet you once again on Law and Order.
Thank you.
That's Law and Order for you today. We'll join you next week at the same time with another special topic on Law and Order. Enjoy the rest of the programming on Channel I. Have a good night and a good weekend.